I've been throwing knives for nearly my whole life, and when people find that out about me, they tend to have one of two reactions. Number one, they'll ask me when I'm going to run off and join the circus, or number two, they'll assume that it has something to do with fighting. Now, it's true that those are the two broad categories of weapons throwing or of knife throwing, but what isn't true, what the public doesn't really generally realize, is that the type of knife throwing that you see in the circus or the carnival or in a stage performance has really nothing in common with the kinds of weapons throwing that are used by martial artists.
Really, up until now, there have been three basic schools of weapons throwing. The style of throwing we are going to talk about here is a new way, a fourth way of throwing, and it looks different than what you see in other styles. It's much easier to show you what it is than to describe it. Once you see what this improvisational style looks like, you start to understand the differences pretty quickly. But to really understand what it is, we first have to understand what it is not, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about knife throwing. So first, let's briefly survey the three older schools of throwing. The first of those schools, the first thing this school of throwing is not, is intended for the circus or the carnival or for stage performances. There are any number of differences between the martial arts-oriented schools of throwing and the traditional Western-style circus or carnival-type throwing, because obviously they have entirely different goals. The main philosophical difference is that martial arts throwers train to throw any weapon from any distance and under any circumstances, whereas circus-style knife throwing is limited to the same knife from the same distance, and you're always throwing under the same set of circumstances. Carnival-type throwers can't change the distance, the speed of the throw, or the knife. They can only stand at one set distance and throw one knife at the same speed from that same distance. Carnival-style throwers don't need to be able to control the rotation or the spin of a knife because they always throw under those very controlled conditions, such as a game or a highly staged performance. Martial arts throwers don't expect to be able to throw under controlled conditions, so instead they want to be able to control the knife. So the main technical difference between the martial arts styles of throwing and the circus performance style of throwing is that martial arts throwers can actually control the rotation of a knife instead of being controlled by it. They do this sometimes by controlling the rate of knife rotation or spin, but most often by eliminating spin altogether, which is the main technique that is common to the different schools of martial arts throwing, and which is most often called the no-spin throw or the spinless throw, or sometimes called the quarter-spin throw. We will show methods of both eliminating spin and controlling spin in this video. So the biggest defining difference of the martial arts schools like ours and the entertainment-based schools is mobility, the ability to throw any knife from any distance.
Comparisons between a style of throwing that's really only designed to create an impression in front of an audience and one that's designed for the real world are really apples and oranges. One has a skill set that's more along the lines of a magic trick. The other has a skill set that's more along the lines of athletics.
With that said, traditional Western-style, circus performance-style knife throwing does have some aspects we find valuable. What we have in common with the stage performance school is that we like to use equipment similar to theirs. Unlike the two other schools of martial arts-oriented weapons throwers, we are first and foremost knife throwers, and some of the best and toughest knives in the world are made by Western throwing knife makers or using the techniques that they pioneered. The other contribution that stage performance style throwing makes is that they have legitimized knife throwing as entertainment, as something harmless, which is actually good for the more serious throwers because busybodies the world over would no doubt make the evils of knife throwing into an issue if they knew what the more serious throwers were up to. We believe there is nothing wrong with the entertainment aspect of knife throwing, although we do a different type of entertainment throwing than the circus performance type of throwing, our style being closer to extreme sports types of trick throwing. Even if you don't do the tricks or the games and gimmick style throwing yourself, it's good to create the impression of entertainment in your throwing because it makes it much more socially acceptable. And anyway, as we will learn later, some of these trick throws we developed are actually excellent training exercises.
The second school of weapons throwing we'd like to talk about is the Western school of weapons throwing that's most associated with the martial artists of Eastern Europe, but also some Americans and others. This school uses a variety of techniques to throw different types of weapons, a lot of them weapons improvised from objects found in the environment.
We can also throw found objects, and the core philosophy of Western weapons throwing is identical to ours. We think in practical terms, and we base our throwing on Western-style hand-to-hand combat and survival. Where we differ is in our techniques. This school tends to use more limited techniques that tend to work better with small weapons. The release mechanics of their style also have limitations, being slower and in most cases requiring more of a wind-up. For those reasons, the practitioners of the Western school tend to prefer to throw smaller objects, not necessarily knives, because their techniques don't work well with large weapons, and also because their style requires an element of surprise because of their more awkward release mechanics. Our basic grip and release is entirely different from that school. We have a much quicker and more compact release. Also, we are able to throw large weapons with ease and don't really need to disguise them as much or rely on the element of surprise as much, because our attack angles and the quickness and adaptability of our release mechanics allow us to get a throw off at targets with a speed and versatility that don't require deception to prevent an opponent from being able to stop it. This means that we aren't limited to small weapons, which obviously have a lot less penetrating power. We can throw the environmental objects, but we don't have to.
Finally, there's the third existing school of weapons throwing that we'd like to talk about. This is the Eastern School of Weapons Throwing, which the most evolved of these is surely the Shuriken School of Japan.
What we have in common with this school is some similarity of basic techniques, mainly the similarity of the grips that we use. The two schools are very similar in superficial appearance. Where we differ is in philosophy. Shuriken is generally more associated with martial arts purely as an art, whereas we concentrate more on the martial aspects. Also, Shuriken is more of an assassination style. They prefer to use small darts which can be poisoned and thrown at long range. They come more from traditional Eastern philosophy and culture, a time when this style made sense, a time when people carried swords and rendered knives a little redundant. Whereas what we do is more suited to a modern Western culture and mentality. It's more of a power style intended for hand-to-hand combat at close range instead of assassination with poisoned darts.
If you want to say that our school is an eclectic collection of bits and pieces from other schools, well, you'd partly be correct. Certainly what we do is informed by all the other schools of weapons throwing. We try to take the best parts of each school and meld them into a unified whole.
There's no one perfect universal technique for everyone. One thing we will learn throughout this video is that everything in throwing is a trade-off. You have to give something up in order to get something else. That's part of why these different schools exist. They all have a different emphasis. In our school, we are interested only in results. We don't care about anyone's traditions or rules of any kind. We take whatever works and tailor it to the individual. But we do one thing that is new and different enough to qualify us not just as a hybrid of existing schools, but as a new school, a fourth way of weapons throwing. The main technical difference between our school and the existing school of weapons throwing is our use of a flexible wrist action and a more sliding release in our no-spin throwing, as opposed to other schools which tend to use locked wrists and more abrupt releases. This gives us the ability to throw from any angle, more so than any other style. The reliance on the wrist instead of the fingers means we don't need fine finger dexterity. We can throw even with our hands incapacitated. This is important for survival because only gross motor skills remain in a panic situation. Fine dexterity disappears in a real fight. Wrist flip also gives us a lot of power and the ability to throw larger weapons harder and more effectively than with other styles. We also have a flatter, straighter flight pattern than the other no-spin styles, which makes our style a little more likely to hit with a point. This means you don't need to be able to judge the distance precisely with our style, which is what makes throws like these blind throws from different ranges possible, and also makes our style perhaps the easiest style to learn. Our biggest advantage is multiple, flowing, unpredictable attack angles. We can easily adjust our attack angle to hit moving targets or hit targets while we are moving. This makes our style much harder to defend against than the other styles, which rely mostly on surprise or attacking targets that don't fight back.
All these advantages taken together give our style a legitimate claim to being the first school of weapons throwing that can be taken seriously as a hand-to-hand style of weapons throwing, a true survival-oriented weapons throwing style. We prefer knives to other types of throwing weapons. Now, we do believe in being versatile and being able to throw a lot of different things, but primarily as a skill builder and as something to fall back on, not as something that you want to build your entire system around.
There are two basic reasons we don't prefer found objects or environmental objects. One, they break, so you can't really practice with them. They're going to break if you do. And two, they're not going to be there when you really need them. They're just unreliable in a pinch. Nobody who teaches using a gun for self-defense would teach you to rely on a loaded gun appearing at just the moment you need it instead of carrying it, so there's not much logic in not carrying throwing weapons if you intend to have them when you need them. Because you're dependent on finding something random out of the blue, again, you can't practice with environmental weapons, and that means they might not perform as well as you'd like in a panic situation. And in any event, you would need to find two weapons anyway if you're going to throw one, because if you only have one weapon, you have to keep it as a hand weapon. You can't waste it by chancing a throw. So not only would you have to stumble across one weapon, you'd have to somehow come up with two just when you needed them. If you really want to throw something that's legal to carry, sharpen the points on some screwdrivers. These are not found objects, environmental objects. You can carry them and practice with them. Large screwdrivers are durable and can really do some damage, so these are a legitimate alternative to carrying throwing knives in the more paranoid urban dystopias where knives are viewed with suspicion. We like knives over spikes or anything else because they're useful as a tool and useful as a hand weapon, and because they simply have more striking power. We like them better than swords or bayonets because in today's world you can't carry anything that large, obviously, and in any event these are very slow releasing weapons that totally lack the element of surprise. Short of a firearm or some other projectile weapon, the knife is the ultimate weapon, and inside 25 feet or so, which is indoor range, probably even better than a firearm. So what we emphasize in our school is knife throwing, even though the methods are applicable to other weapons.
We've decided that we're primarily knife throwers, so now the question is, what kind of knives? Well, there are three qualities that we prefer for knives that we use for throwing. One is balance, one is durability, and another is size.
We like knives that are balanced like normal knives, which have handles and are therefore heavier on the handle side. The other thing is we want knives that are the right size, usually somewhere between 10 and 14 inches or even bigger, especially to learn with. Later we will see that beginners will tend to learn the Thorn style more easily using big knives and learn the shuriken style more easily using small knives.
The first and maybe most important thing to know about the balance of a knife is how to find the balance point of a knife.
Here's how to find a balance point. Make a little seesaw of a knife sitting on your finger or another knife, and the point where it will sit without tipping off is the balance point. For a lot of the throwing knives you'll buy off the rack, which really isn't recommended, it will be in the center at 50%. For normal knives, by which I mean any knife with a handle, it will be just about where we like it, which is at 38% from the back of the handle. And this is also true of a lot of screwdrivers.
The ideal balance ratio for a weapon thrown in the no-spin style is determined by phi, or the golden section, which is a well-known mathematical constant.
The exact formula is the total length of the knife times 0.62 equals the distance from the point of the knife to the preferred balance point. For example, on a 10-inch knife, the balance point would be on the handle side, 6.2 inches from the point, or 3.8 inches from the butt end. But remember, this ratio doesn't need to be precise. A practice thrower can throw things with all kinds of funny balance ratios. The balance ratio is to help a beginner and to maximize performance.
The second quality that we prefer in a throwing weapon is size. We tend to like the larger weapons for throwing in our style.
We're also going to talk about shuriken, which uses smaller weapons, but to learn the wrist action style that we prefer, we need knives maybe 14 inches long to make it easier to learn, although you can go smaller and smaller as you get more skilled. One way to learn our style is to start out with big knives, even swords, and then gradually work your way down to a more manageable size. As we say, everything in throwing is a trade-off. Smaller weapons are more accurate and quicker releasing. Larger weapons have more power and range.
The third thing we'd like to have in a throwing weapon is durability. There are two ways that you can acquire a throwing weapon. One is to make one is to buy one. And if you want real durability, you're probably going to have to spend a little bit more money.
Most of you aren't custom makers, so the first option is to buy one. And if you're willing to spend the money, do use custom heat-treated equipment. It's worth the investment because it won't break. That's what beginners and amateurs don't realize about custom knives, and I was once in this position myself. Custom knives just don't break, and they easily outperform normal knives of any kind because they're dense and hard. If you throw any kind of normal knife, even a good one, if it's not intended for throwing, you will break it. It's just a matter of time. Any good custom throwing knife with a handle built in will perform well for our style of throwing, even without having that precise golden section balance ratio. Many of the knives I'm using in this video are an example, ordinary custom-made traditional throwing knives with normal handles made by Bobby Branton and without that precise balance ratio.
Ideally, you would have a knife that didn't have any handle at all because they're easier to carry and easier to conceal. But how do you get a normal balance ratio in a knife if it doesn't have a handle? Well, we've come up with a way to do this. The way you do that is by taking weight out of the blade side of the knife.
This was co-designed by me and a man named Chris Kelly, sort of my concepts in his execution. We've balanced this knife with a series of graduated holes. Located properly, these holes will not weaken the blade. I've thrown prototypes of these thousands of times and they didn't break even in the cheaper version. The holes also give a better grip for the blade throw, which we'll learn later, and they give it a signature look. This is called the Sure Knife, sort of a combination of the word shuriken and the word knife, which is our philosophy, I guess. These come in different styles and are designed for all-around performance.
The other thing you can do, even if you're not a knife maker, is to make your own throwing weapons. What you need to do is just get a big knife blade and make an improvised handle from tape, just balancing the blade according to the golden section. And the way you can do that is just to strip the handle off, strip the tang off, wrap tape around it to make a whole new handle.
You'll probably want to remove existing handles because they're going to break off anyway and might make the weapon harder to release. Take the handle and the false tang off and wrap it with tape until it fits your hand well and balances at the preferred balance point. Ideally, it would be 14 to 18 inches long for a beginner to learn with. Use silver duct tape or even aluminum foil tape for look and for visibility, and maybe silver spray paint on the blade itself. Dull the point and the blades of any knives that you're going to throw if they're too sharp to be safe. Tape is a durable substitute handle for any kind of throwing weapon, and it's not a bad idea to put a layer of tape on the handles of all your weapons to protect them and to give a better grip.
When it comes to carrying knives, everybody's different. It's, again, like so much else in knife throwing, it's a matter of trade-offs. You're trading the ability to conceal and to be able to easily carry a small knife versus a larger knife that might have a little more stopping power. And the way you carry knives is going to be relative to your physical environment, your social environment, the way you dress. I can't really help you with that. That's such an individual decision. In my case, I think more along the lines of being able to get a knife into my hand without anybody noticing it, rather than whether or not I could get a knife into my hand quickly, because a knife already in your hand is faster than the fastest fast draw alive. Well, now we've got our knives, now we just need something to throw at. When you're first learning to throw, you might use something soft such as foam archery targets, cardboard, hay. You might even use the ground as a target. But when you get a little more serious about knife throwing, I think you're going to want to start using targets made out of wood.
And don't use trees because you'll kill them. and a good shade tree will be more valuable for the shade than as a target.
There are three basic types of knife throwing targets. There's log ends, there's poles, and there's flat boards. Again, like everything else, it's a trade-off between advantages and disadvantages of each. The first type of target we like to talk about is log ends.
Log ends are only useful for the simplest and most basic kinds of practice. They're not the best choice for martial arts throwing, but more for demonstrations. An advantage is that they're easy to stick, and also they force you to be accurate, and also they last a long time. The disadvantages are that they're too small to replicate a real opponent and too dangerous because knives tend to glance off the edges of log ends in unpredictable ways. And also these kinds of targets are too difficult for many people to acquire and to set up. One way you can fake a log end type target is to use the ends of 2x4s bound together or put in a box, but those can be hard to come by as well. So you'll want to save the pieces of your 2x4 targets after they get splintered from throwing.
The second type of target is a pole target, like these.
Poles are the best targets for the extremely advanced thrower because they can be attacked from all angles equally well. They force accuracy, and they're easily replaced and fairly durable. But these are also not recommended for beginners because they're extremely dangerous to throw at. Round poles send knives back at the thrower far more than other types of targets. They're just too unpredictable.
The third type of target is a flat board target, such as these 2x6s I have here. These are the best types of targets for beginners.
The advantages of these: number one, predictability. You'll learn what angle knives will glance off of them, and it's not random, so these are the safest targets. Another advantage is size. These are easy to hit, so you don't end up missing the target altogether and misplacing a knife. Another advantage is portability. These are easy to carry and easy to set up. The sole disadvantage is that these are sometimes harder to stick than other targets because of the flat angle and the vertical wood grain, which tends to reject knives that don't strike with the plane of the blade vertical. These are just as simple as they look. Make a large door-like frame and then attach boards vertically, or else just tack a few together with horizontal pieces on the back. Put the nails at the top and the bottom, not right in the middle where the knives are hidden. Don't use plywood or composite materials. Use junk 2x4s or 2x6s. Make them nice and tight, nice and solid, so they won't have a trampoline effect on the knives. Loose boards will actually tend to bounce knives back. Don't get fancy with anything you throw knives at. You're only going to destroy them anyway. Use scrap lumber. You can make these very mobile by combining them with a pole target. If they're as tall as you are, you can flip them upside down and keep using them when they get worn because all the wear should be on the top half. You can turn these targets sideways to throw at for added safety. If you throw at a 45-degree angle to a flat target, misses will tend to fly away from you harmlessly. The only drawback is that you will, of course, fail to stick a lot more throws doing this. Another idea for safety is to use low targets. Throwing at targets 3 or 4 feet high will keep the angle of the knives lower on misses, which will make the knives less likely to glance back in a way that can seriously injure the thrower. This is also good practice for certain combat or hunting throws, and the mechanics of throwing at low targets are the same as throwing at higher ones, so there's no real drawback to using these. These tend to be the easiest targets to find, so you'll always want to have a few low targets around. Use 2 targets so you can go back and forth between them if it's possible, and for the same reason, use as many knives as you can get. It's really nice if you have an indoor area, but not necessary. If you have backstops and good planning, you can have quite a large target complex outdoors, which is better if possible because the light is better and it's just more fun to be outside. For all types of targets, you need to be aware of where knives will go if they miss. And for smaller targets, you should have backstops. Wire works well, such as poultry wire or old bed springs. Be aware at all times of where a knife could go and what it could do because at some point it will do that. Wear protection over your eyes and your throat. Don't throw while you're chemically altered or distracted in any way. Keep a cell phone and something you can use to make a tourniquet nearby just in case, and perhaps some medical tape to wrap any wounds you might acquire.
Safety, of course, is the #1 priority in knife throwing, which, like a lot of things worth doing, has an element of danger involved. You need to take personal responsibility for your safety and the safety of anyone that's around you when you're throwing knives or they're watching you throwing knives. You need to be alert and aware of everything that's going on, and you need to not take any chances. The most basic throw in our School of Weapons Throwing, the most basic throw we'll talk about in this video, is the style of no-spin throwing that I developed as a youngster through practice and experimentation, and has come to be known as the Thorn style of throwing. Now, obviously, I'm not without some bias, but I think that for practical purposes, you're going to find that this is the best throw for just about anything you want to be able to do. There are reasons other than practical reasons to throw knives, and we'll show you some of the less practical ways to throw knives in this video. But for serious purposes, I think this is the throw you're going to want to learn, because this is the only throw that I know of that doesn't have any serious weaknesses.
You'll find that at least 90% of everything you really need to do will revolve around this throw. We'll break this throw into 4 elements for the purposes of discussion. The elements of the no-spin throw are: number 1, grip; number 2, wrist action in the context of arm action, arm angle, and everything else; number 3, finger action; and finally, number 4, the release, and especially the timing of the release. We'll go over each of these 4 elements one by one.
Here's the way we grip a knife for the no-spin throw.
Place your index finger or your middle finger on the edge of the knife, the thumb on the flat side of the knife. An index finger oriented grip is probably more versatile, a middle finger grip perhaps a little more powerful. Do not put the very tip of the thumb on the knife, just the inside of that area of your knuckle, so that you won't be tempted to squeeze tightly on release. You have to have a relaxed grip and a relaxed release, not clenching or tight. The butt end of the weapon is at about the center of your palm, maybe just a touch higher. This is best described as a cupping grip. If the weapon has one sharp edge, of course you'll want that edge away from your palm. That is, the unsharpened side will be against your fingertip or fingertips.
The second element of the no-spin throw we'd like to talk about is the wrist action, and this is the main way that we differ from other styles of no-spin throwing. We use more of a slapping or flipping action with the wrist.
First, the wrist is cocked back, then it comes forward. This is the propulsion mechanism that gives extra power and allows us to throw from different angles easily. Remember, you cock the wrist back before every throw. If you do this as a beginner, it will almost force you to use the correct wrist action when learning. The wrist has what is best described as a hinge action, a slapping action. The wrist is, again, the main propulsion mechanism in our style, but the arm action affects it. If you have more or less of one, you might need more or less of the other, and that's also true to a lesser degree with the amount of flip you impart to the weapon with the fingertip or fingertips as you release the throw. The wrist action and the use of a scooping, sliding release are more important than a precise grip.
The third element of the no-spin throw that we like to talk about is the finger action. We use a finger action where you lightly stroke the handle of the knife on release.
This is a wiping, sliding release where the fingertips gently brush the knife as it slides naturally out of the hand. This helps to straighten the weapon for its flight pattern. You will learn to use a light wiping motion with the index or middle finger to adjust the knife, and again, according to how much wrist flip and how much arm action you're putting into the throw, you might have to use a little more or a little less finger action. However, don't obsess over this or even be conscious of it as a beginner, because remember, there's not a fine level of dexterity needed. Otherwise, I couldn't do things like this easily.
The fourth element that we'd like to talk about of the no-spin throw is the release, and especially the timing of the release. This is something you really have to teach yourself through practice and experimentation, because the release timing is different for every throw.
The release is typically more of a sliding release, more of a gradual action. Release is a little earlier than with a ball. It's a scooping or slinging action, something like the way you would scoop up a handful of snow or sand and sling it. The weapon begins sliding out earlier than beginners tend to think, and the wrist is being flipped as the knife is released. This is the key to understanding release. Timing in the context of your arm, wrist, and finger action, and the balance of the knife and the distance and the angle of the throw and everything else.
The main thing that you have to do is to observe why you're missing and to make adjustments so that you won't miss. Remember, if the knife is hitting with the point up, that generally means that you're not flipping your wrist hard enough or you're releasing the knife too early. If it's hitting the target with the point down, you flipped your wrist too hard, or maybe you released the knife a little bit too late.
Watch how the knife hits the target. If the point hits up, release later or flip the wrist harder. This type of impact is less likely for beginners, however, and will probably only happen if you're using a release that's too abrupt, that is, more of a shuriken-style pushing release, from a range that is too close to the target. If the knives are spinning forward and hitting the target with the point down, you need to reduce spin. You'll probably do this by releasing earlier or flipping the wrist less, or possibly by using more of a pushing action with a more abrupt release instead of a hard flipping action. As a beginner, you're probably going to want to throw this throw at as low a velocity as possible and with as gentle a wrist flip as possible in order to better be able to figure out what you're doing and how it's affecting the flight pattern of the weapon. You have to experiment a little, and you need to be able to visualize what's happening with weapons even as you're throwing them to understand what's happening and then visualize the corrections. Eventually, corrections will become second nature. You'll have to learn how to time the release yourself. This won't take long, but it can only be done through observation and then by giving yourself feedback and changing whatever it is you're doing wrong so that you won't fail to hit the target with the point. It's important to be relaxed and observant in your early experiments. Let the knife slide out easily without thinking about it too much. Don't force it, let it come out by itself. You won't be throwing hard in the beginning, that's for advanced throwers, and you won't be very accurate, which is another reason to have nice, big, flat targets. You might also use the ground as a target in the very beginning. If you can stick a knife in the ground, you can stick it in a target, and if you can stick it from 3 feet away today, it'll be 5 feet tomorrow and 12 feet next week, maybe 20 feet next month. Sometimes it's a little easier to understand the action of the spinless throw with extremely long weapons, such as this sword blade. Typically, your motion will be relaxed with your wrist back limply, your grip fairly light, as your arm is moving forward up towards your head. Then as your arm is coming back down and you begin to reach the release point, which is at about eye level, you'll snap the wrist and let the knife come completely out, or at least it feels that way. Then the wrist and arm follow through. However, there's no formula, and the release point is never exactly the same for any two throws. It's a useful exercise to wear a sock on your hand to perfect the release action. If you do it while sitting down, it will also keep you from worrying much about stance or arm action, and you'll be forced to throw just using the wrist. This reduces the amount of information you have to process and forces you to just focus on holding the knife in place for a moment with light thumb pressure, then throwing it using the arm and the wrist. We also do this to prove to ourselves that while stance and arm angle and grip and so on matter, they're not the key thing to learn. The key thing is the scooping release and the whip-like wrist action. It feels kind of like you're pulling a string or cracking a whip. We see here that the arm isn't involved in the throw at all, only the wrist. This is the essence of the no-spin throw we use.
Now, everything that we've talked about so far is true in one sense, but in another sense it's false, because there's really no way to break this one continuous motion of a knife throw into these discrete parts that we have, into these discrete elements. If you're thinking, I'm going to do one thing with my arm, another thing with my wrist, another thing with my fingertips, you're never going to be able to stick a knife, because in reality all of that affects everything else, and it's one continuous motion.
You have to release the knife instinctively, not according to a formula. Every one of these elements influences every other element, and in addition, your arm angle, stance, and choice of weapons, and to some degree the distance from the target will influence it. If you do more of something with your arm, you might have to do less of it with your wrist or your fingers, and vice versa. If you're throwing for range, you might release earlier. If you're throwing for power, you might release later. If you're throwing at an unusual angle or around an obstacle, or adjusting your release to hit a moving target, you might have to use a more or less abrupt release to adjust to those circumstances. There's no way for your conscious mind to handle all that information in the second or so it takes to throw, so the release has to be done unconsciously, instinctively, just like throwing a rock or a ball or anything else. Your hand will almost learn how to throw by itself if you keep your brain from getting in the way. Integrate all the aspects of the throw into one motion. Sometimes it feels like cracking a whip. Sometimes it feels a little like shooting a basketball. Sometimes more like throwing a baseball. But really, it always feels like throwing a knife once you learn it. And the good thing is, once that light comes on, it's like riding a bicycle. You'll never forget it.
What we're learning here is probably the easiest way there is to throw a knife, and for most people, they pick it up very quickly. The only exception would be maybe people that are used to using some other style where you use a locked wrist.
One reason I like to show images of myself throwing in these difficult circumstances is to build confidence in beginners. Think about this. If I can throw with socks on my hands or throw multiple knives with my weak hand and so on, how hard can it really be? It takes a little longer to learn this style if you're used to using some other style, but you'll get it in time. In those rare cases where people fail to learn, I think it's because they're looking for some trick or some gimmick that will let them stick a knife without any effort on their part. And when they aren't provided with that, they just quickly burn out and give up. If you're doing real weapons throwing, it's like anything else. People are going to learn at different speeds according to their dedication and natural ability level. The best teacher you will ever have is yourself, because in the final analysis, every real thrower is self-taught. I can tell you everything I know about knife throwing, but it doesn't replace actual experience. I want to emphasize this because the main thing people do wrong, as I said, is they don't bring anything to the process themselves. They give up too early because they fail to adjust, fail to experiment, fail to figure out what the knife is doing wrong and act to change it. Then they blame it on the theory, but what they fail to understand is that throwing isn't theoretical, it's actual, and a matter of actual experience.
Another thing to keep in mind is that to a really serious thrower, stick percentage isn't very meaningful. It's meaningful if you're given a demonstration. It's meaningful to some degree as a safety issue, because if knives are sticking in, they're not bouncing back and coming back and hurt you. But what matters in real life isn't stick percentage, it's point first impact.
I could make 100 perfect throws at a brick wall and not stick any of them. On the other hand, soft targets will be easier to stick. You could stick 100 or any number of throws if you were throwing at something like a bale of hay, but it doesn't prove anything. Or you might fail to stick targets because you're throwing duller weapons. But the main thing that causes a knife not to stick in isn't so much that they aren't hitting with the point, but when they come in from an angle where the plane of the knife blade is not exactly the same as the plane of the target, such as when you throw sidearm while directly facing a flat target. Some of the best throws I've ever made were sidearm throws that didn't actually stick in because they came in point first but at a 45-degree angle to a target, and they might have torn a piece of a target out that was about as long as my forearm or split a board wide open, but they didn't actually stick in because of the sideways angle. Don't get frustrated because knives aren't sticking. Worry about point first impact. Ask yourself, would I want to have been hit with that throw? That's the true determination of effectiveness, not some meaningless number of sticks.
What we'd like to talk about now is another way to throw a weapon so that it doesn't rotate, another no-spin style. Now, superficially, it looks a great deal like the style that we use, although in fact the mechanics of throwing are different, and these two styles could almost be described as complementary, almost as a yin to the other's yang. What I'm talking about is the shuriken style of Japan, and particularly the most advanced type of shuriken throwing that I know of, which I got from Huzan Suzuki of Japan.
Shuriken, as we said earlier, was originally built around throwing spikes. As knife throwers, there are two reasons for us to learn shuriken. One is that one way to understand what the Thorn style is to understand what it is not by contrasting it. But the most important is that it's a very useful technique in its own right that lets us do a couple of things that our style doesn't necessarily work as well for. The most important advantage of shuriken from our perspective is that it allows us to throw small, abnormally balanced weapons from greater range than the Thorn style. Some people want to be able to throw their pocket knife, and if so, shuriken is for you. Just be warned that you will probably break a pocket knife by throwing it. In the West, most of us associate shuriken with throwing stars, but these interesting little weapons are only a small part of shuriken throwing. The shuriken grip is more of a pinching grip, with the edges of the fingers not wrapped around the weapon, but with the fingertips more on the sides of the weapon, and the tip of the control finger, again the index or middle finger, is placed on the balance point of the weapon, wherever that might be. Shuriken throwers adjust the grip to the balance point, unlike us. Shuriken style adjusts the grip and keeps the release the same, whereas Thorn style adjusts the release and keeps the grip the same. Shuriken release is more abrupt and the throw is more of a pushing action. The wrist action is more of a frozen or locked wrist until the weapon is released. In Shuriken, the wrist flips after the weapon is released, not during the release as with the Thorn style. If the Thorn style release can be described as being like cracking a whip, the technique for Shuriken is more of a shot put action. Or if you know what a knuckleball in baseball is, Shuriken is something like that. Shuriken style generates power more so with the shoulder, where Thorn style is more with the wrist and the fingers and the whole body action. Shuriken feels like you're throwing your arm along with the weapon, culminating in the moment of release, where Thorn style again feels more like cracking a whip, where the knife release is more incidental, more part of the whole motion. To understand the key difference in these styles, I think we have to look at the flight patterns of each, which differ. Shuriken has a flight pattern that's more of a lob or more of a quarter spin, so you'll want to be a little more conscious of the distance from the target with Shuriken. To some degree, you have to give the point room to drop in with Shuriken. Because Shuriken is a quarter spin more than a pure spinless flight, it has longer range. This is because the knife begins coming almost straight out with Thorn style, which might be described as a 1/8 spin, whereas with Shuriken style the weapon is pointed upwards on release. Shuriken style's more elongated flight pattern reduces spin so much that weapons hitting point up and not having time for the point to drop so it will stick is more of a problem with this style. Of course, the trade-off is that you get greater range with Shuriken than with our style. You trade power and versatility from close range for longer range and the ability to throw very small objects. The rule of thumb is that if a knife is large or a target is within hand-to-hand range, use Thorn style. If the target is far away or the weapon is very small, use Shuriken style.
Again, the whole key to understanding the difference in these two styles is the release and the flight pattern. With the Shuriken style, the knife, the weapon, leaves the hand with a point more up. With the Thorn style, it's a little bit more pointing towards the target. With the Shuriken style, you have more of an abrupt release, more of a pushing release. With the Thorn style, more of a gradual release, less of one moment exactly when the knife leaves your hand.
Understand that what we do is on one end of the spectrum and Shuriken is on the other, and the two styles complement each other perfectly. One comes into its own where the other diminishes. But in between are an infinite number of ways to release a weapon. This all goes back to mastering a release, which, as I continue to emphasize, is the key to this style of throwing. No two releases are ever exactly the same. To some degree, these two styles meet in the middle in the space of 9 or so inch knives. What you don't want to do as a beginner is to mix Thorn style with Shuriken style. If you use the flexible wrist, use the more sliding release. If you use the locked wrist, use the frozen pushing release. Later on, you'll be able to hybridize the two styles, for example, by throwing the larger weapons from long range by using the Thorn grip and wrist action propulsion, but with the Shuriken frozen release to elongate the flight pattern into a lob or a quarter spin.
Once they're getting knives to stick, of course, people want to advance their skills. They want to know, how can I throw through a brick wall? How can I thread the eye of a needle with a knife? Above all else, what they always want is more range, more power, and more accuracy. And the simple answer to all that is that to get those things, you just need to get a lot of repetitions.
Everything in throwing is interrelated, and everything, as we said, is a trade-off. The basic skill set is a trade-off between these different elements: power and range and accuracy and mobility and a quick release. You have to decide on any given throw according to the circumstances how much of each of these you're going to sacrifice to get something else. What you're trying to do after mastering the basic release mechanic is to develop power. We emphasize power because power is what will enable you to do all the other things we do. And to develop power in the beginning, you'll have to master stance. The key to understanding throwing stances is the position of the feet relative to the position of the shoulders. In an overhand power stance, your feet should be parallel to the target face and your shoulders squared. That is, your shoulders should be at a 90-degree angle to the target. The second thing to understand about stance is the weight shift. Your weight begins on your back foot, and as you throw, it shifts to the foot closer to the target. Your throwing arm comes across the body, ending up with your hand at the opposite knee in the follow-through. Be sure not to throw from any closer than 15 feet away while doing these power throws, because if you miss and the knife comes back at you, you won't have a chance to dodge if you're leaning into the throw in this way. Range and power are two different things. It's possible to throw a long way but not have much power on the throw by using more of a lobbing style. We gain range by developing shuriken style and also to some degree by gaining power, but a good thrower will always have more range than he realistically needs for hand-to-hand combat. Long-range throws look impressive to spectators and are good skill builders, but they don't really have as much practical use because they're too easy for an opponent to dodge or block, especially if he knows the throw is coming. Accuracy is one thing you really don't have to practice specifically. We develop accuracy automatically through sheer repetition. If you like, the best exercise is to throw a group of knives into as small an area as possible. By the way, this is much easier if you use knives without handles because they take up a smaller space. Like sticking knives into soft targets or extreme long-range throwing, this kind of accuracy is important for demonstrations but doesn't mean much for anything else. It's nice if you can hit a bullseye every time, but the bullseye isn't trying to dodge and it can't fight back. We want to be accurate, but as practical throwers, not as entertainment throwers, we have to be accurate in the context of hitting moving targets hard with a quick release.
I once said that our school's motto is any knife, any distance, any angle, any position, no games, no gimmicks, no limits. And at level 1, we've at least done the first part of that. We've learned to throw any knife from any distance. Only you can determine when you're ready to go on to the next level. But I think that if you can stick weapons consistently from a range of maybe 15 feet with full power and stick a variety of different weapons, that you're well on your way to considering yourself to be a level 1 thrower. At level 1, we gained the ability to hit a target from any distance with about any weapon, but we were concerned mostly with throwing at stationary targets while our feet were set firmly on the ground. And some people are content to stay at level 1, but you won't be content to stay at level 1 if you want to be a martial arts thrower. You're going to want to go to level 2 and beyond.
What we're trying to do at level 2 is the second part of our motto, 2 things to throw from any body position and from any angle. In real situations, you don't know what position you'll have to throw from, and different throws and types of throws are necessary from different body positions. Stationary throws from unusual positions are another exercise, but again can be very dangerous to practice. So make sure you keep yourself in a position where you'll be able to block the knife or get out of its way if you choose to try this in training.
At level 2, we want to get away from the necessity of having a particular footwork configuration or a particular body position altogether. What we're going to try to do is to learn to throw with compact power from different angles and from all kinds of different body positions. And that also is going to involve learning some new throws.
The underhand no spin is the first new angle we want to learn. This is a natural, obvious throw and is common to all the schools of throwing. This is primarily a short-range throw. Its advantages are a very quick release and the fact that it is easy to throw from a compact defensive stance. The disadvantages are a lack of power and range relative to some other throws, and the fact that it is really only useful from one attack angle. This throw is a lot like an uppercut punch, and don't underestimate its effectiveness from hand-to-hand range.
There are 3 basic elements to this throw: the grip, the arm and wrist action, and the release, and they're not necessarily the same as the overhand no-spin throw.
There are 2 ways to grip a knife for this throw. One is used if you're using a knife without a handle, in which case you use the same standard grip as before. Index finger on the spine, thumb on the flat of the knife. The other grip is used if the knife has a large handle, in which case it will probably be more effective to throw it with the plane of the blade held vertically, in which case you adjust your grip. In this version of the underhand grip, the thumb is on top of the spine and the index finger is on the flat of the handle. The arm action of this throw differs from the overhand spinless throw by the use of a locked wrist and elbow. This throw uses an upwards rising chopping motion, with the wrist and elbow held straight and power generated by the shoulder action, which acts as a pivot, as in the overhand shuriken style. And the stance is typically more open and compact than an overhand throw, with a lead foot pointed a little more towards the target and the shoulders not as square. The weight shift is less pronounced, with the body weight staying more on the back foot during the throwing motion. One fortunate aspect of throwing underhand is that the arms end in front of the face in the follow-through, making it easier to block a knife that bounces back at the thrower. The release is also different from the overhand no spin, being more like a shuriken release in which the hand is thrown open suddenly on release. This throw has a natural upwards rising attack angle. You can also simulate the underhand attack angle using the normal overhand spinless throw with sort of an exaggerated scooping action.
The spinless underhand is probably the easiest throw there is, and most people take to it very quickly. It just takes a lot of repetition to be able to build up range and power with that throw. What we'd like to talk about now is another style of underhand throwing, one that's identical to the spinless underhand throw in terms of stance and grip, but it involves allowing the knife to rotate one full turn in its flight pattern.
Because it involves controlling a full one-spin rotation from any distance from a few feet to 70 or more feet, this throw is not reliable enough to be practical, but is almost entirely recreational. But there are things to be said for recreation. The biggest is that if you aren't having fun, you won't be motivated to practice throwing at all. And also just the fact of playing around with knives gives you a feel for the way they're balanced and the way they behave when thrown. The key to the rotating underhand throw is controlling how fast or how slow the knife spins around on its way to the target. Because if you're going to hit the target with a point, you have to make it spin around exactly once. And to do that, it will have to spin slower if the target is far away or faster if the target is nearer. So what you're trying to do is learn how to judge distance and adjust the speed at which the knife is spinning to that distance. I'd like to give you some magic formula for doing this, but it's impossible. It's purely instinct. No one can teach you how to do this. You can only teach yourself through practice. Tossing a knife into the air and catching it at different heights is one way to learn the kind of control this takes. By the way, use very dull knives until you know how to juggle them. It will be easier to learn this kind of control using large knives with large handles.
The final basic throw we'd like to talk about, the final basic flight pattern, is the half spin throw or the blade throw. This is an interesting throw because it combines the skill set that is necessary for all the other throws we talk about. You can throw it from overhand or underhand. It has the necessity of judging distance that the rotating underhand throw has. It uses a grip and a release that are sort of a hybrid between the Thorn style no spin throw and the shuriken style no spin throw. That makes it a really excellent practice throw, and it's also a really fun recreational throw. Its main practical purpose is to extend our range over the no-spin throw. If you're a sniper more than a hand-to-hand fighter, this might be the throw for you.
The idea of the blade throw is again to control the rotation of the knife, making it spin faster if the target is near and slower if the target is far. But this time we're throwing by the blade and we only have to control a half spin, not a full spin, and it's much easier to control a half spin than a full spin. This control can be achieved in many ways, for example by choking up or down on the grip, or by throwing harder or softer, by using a more or less abrupt release, or by some combination of all these things. But the main technique is the use of index finger pressure and a wiping, sliding action as the weapon is being released. The blade throw is much like the no-spin throw in this way, and the blade throw uses the same grip as the no-spin throw, only of course you hold the knife or other weapon by the blade. The blade throw uses a sort of hybrid between the shuriken sudden release and the Thorn stroking release, more of one or another according to the size of the knife, the balance point of the knife, and the distance and the speed of the throw. The overhand version of this throw is essentially identical to the overhand no-spin throw. The stance is the standard overhand throwing stance with the feet approximately parallel to the target and the shoulders squared, and with the standard weight shift from back foot to front foot. The main difference, of course, is in the flight pattern.
Some people think the blade throw is easier to learn underhand. When you throw it underhand, you use a little different grip, one in which the thumb is on the top of the knife, on the flat of the blade, and that allows you to use the thumb as the main digit that controls the throw, and for most of us, the thumb is a little more coordinated than the index or the middle finger.
The thumb grip is the same grip as always, index finger on the spine and the thumb on the flat of the blade. Only to do this throw, you turn the wrist sideways with the plane of the blade horizontal instead of vertical. Of course, the knife still has to rotate 1/2 turn on its way to the target. This version of the blade throw has a more sudden release than the overhand version. It's less stroking and almost entirely the abrupt shuriken style or uppercut style release, with the hand thrown open suddenly. The stance is the same balanced underhand stance with the same reduced back to front weight shift.
A third alternate for throwing the blade throw, the half spin throw, is to use that same grip we use for the underhand style with the thumb on top and just hold the knife horizontally instead of vertically and come at it from an overhand angle.
Again, we use a more abrupt release instead of the sliding release of the no spin or conventional index finger blade throw, snapping the thumb and the wrist to impart the correct amount of spin according to the distance. Of course, more spin if the target is closer, less if it is further.
The blade throw, again, is a really fun throw and excellent recreational throw. It's something that can only be learned through experience, being able to judge that distance and adjust the rotation of the knife according to that distance. There's no shortcut to doing that. It just comes through a lot of repetitions. One great thing about the blade throw is that it's really versatile in terms of equipment, kind of like the shuriken throw in that respect, in that you don't really have a preferred balance point with this style. You can easily adjust your grip up or down on the blade to change the balance, the feel of the balance, to however you like it. Now we've learned to throw any knife from any distance. We can throw by the handle or by the blade. We know different ways to no spin a knife. We can half spin it, we can one spin it. All that's left to achieve our goal of any knife, any distance, any angle, any position is the mastery of these bizarre angles, such as the around the back or between the legs kind of things.
The good news is all other angles aside from the pure underhand are variations of the normal no-spin overhand grip. That throw can be made from just about any arm angle that is humanly possible. The key to learning these unusual angles is to generate power without putting your whole arm into it, which is really only possible by using the elbow and wrist action for propulsion. That's why these throws are more limited in range. Most of these throws are useful mainly as a training exercise, but you never know. One of the easiest angles for beginners to learn to throw from is the backhand, but this is not a very useful angle because it's such a weak throw and it leaves you in poor defensive position in the follow-through.
Probably the most useful of these throws from unusual angles is the around the back throw, or as it's also called, the wraparound throw.
The wraparound throw is not purely for entertainment, though it might look that way. This throw again uses the standard overhand no-spin grip and release, but it's based mostly around wrist action because it's hard to generate any arm action with this throw. You can't put your shoulder into it, only your elbow action. So while this throw is somewhat limited in range, it's very quick and comes from a very surprising angle, one that angles upwards into the underside of a person's jaw. So don't discount this throw entirely, it's not just for show.
We've learned a lot of new ways to throw a knife at level 2. We've learned a lot of new angles. But for practical purposes, there's one angle we need to emphasize above all others, and that's the sidearm angle.
The basic elements of throwing that you want to be aware of in your training are footwork, the main element of which is maintaining good balance, release, which you want to be as quick as possible, and range, power, and accuracy, which we touched on previously and which are built up simply through repetition. Developing power helps to train all areas and is the focus of our training. But the main thing when it comes to all these basic elements is eliminating all wasted motion. And the fact is the overhand throwing angle itself, which we learned as level 1 throwers, has a lot of wasted motion in it. It's powerful and accurate, but it causes you to lean towards the target, which is not good, and it is very slow to develop. It has a very slow release. The most important angle to learn for serious purposes by far is the sidearm angle, because this throw gives us both the quick release and the balanced footwork we seek. And some people even find this throw more natural than the overhand throwing. The sidearm throw is the best throw both offensively and defensively. Offensively because it comes from all kinds of angles and because it is very quick releasing. Sidearm throwing has a compact motion that can, again, be compared to cracking a whip. What we want is a quick, unexpected release. Don't telegraph the throw. It should be sudden, like the strike of a snake. Personally, I find that the index finger on the spine grip is more versatile and works better for the sidearm, whereas the middle finger grip maybe works a little better for pure overhand power throwing. Power for the sidearm throw is generated mostly by twisting action of the torso. The defining elements of this throw are, of course, the lower arm angle, coming in from a little higher than 3 o'clock right-handed or 9 o'clock left-handed, but also the foot action and the foot balance. With the sidearm, our lead foot isn't parallel to the target, but almost points at the target. This is a more balanced throw than the overhand. The weight shift is much less pronounced than with the overhand. You don't step in as much. Keeping your weight on your back foot is much safer and keeps you in better balance, which is the most important defensive skill to develop. So not overcommitting your weight to your front foot is the most important thing to learn for a level 2 thrower. And you can really only do that with a sidearm motion.
We learned a lot of new things in level 2, some more useful than others. The most important thing we learned, of course, is the sidearm angle. It's up to you when you want to consider yourself as being ready to go on to level 3, but I think that when you can throw from any possible arm angle, and again, especially the sidearm angle, with the same efficiency that you can throw from overhand, I think you're well on your way to considering yourself a good level 2 thrower. Mobility is a very important skill for a serious thrower to develop, but do be advised, this is where it starts to get more dangerous to practice.
One good thing about learning to throw while you're moving is the fact that it is much the same thing as hitting a moving target, because motion is relative, and it's much easier to do this than to set up moving targets.
The essence of mobility is the ability to throw off balance, that is, without any kind of set stance at all.
As an exercise for understanding what is involved in off-balance throwing, try throwing while standing on only one foot, especially the back foot. That is, the foot on the same side of your body as the hand with which you are throwing.
Another basic exercise that will help you develop mobility is throwing while you're jumping. Now, the basic rule for this is that you have to throw while you're in the air, after you've left the ground, and before your feet hit the ground.
Being suspended in the air by definition forces you to be able to throw without any stance, which is synonymous with being off balance.
You probably won't ever actually need to throw while you're jumping, but I think that you could consider yourself as having graduated level 3 when you can throw off of your back foot, your wrong foot, from at least 10 to 12 feet away, and to throw with something like the same effectiveness you'd have if you had your feet set. The ultimate knife thrower is defined by completeness. He can throw any knife, any distance, any angle, any position, and he can hit targets whether they're moving or whether he's moving, and he can hit targets in improvisational situations.
The mark of the dilettante is to only concentrate on one little niche area of throwing instead of trying to become an all-around thrower. The serious thrower always hates having any kind of limitations and is always on the lookout for some way to overcome those limitations. The really advanced thrower can throw for accuracy if he wants, for power if he wants. He can hit throws on the move. He has a release that is appropriate to the situation, and he can improvise. To the level 4 thrower, the act of throwing is so ingrained that the actual throw is almost secondary. He isn't thinking about the throw, but is aware of all the other circumstances around him. Every throw is different relative to the situation. I can't teach you this because by definition it cannot be practiced. But I can again give you some basic exercises. These exercises involve mostly release, namely developing the ability to adjust the release on the fly. The first of these exercises is to toss a knife into the air and catch it and release a throw in the same motion as the catch. This forces you to release a knife in unexpected ways. This also develops a quicker release and a more reliable release. Remember that you'll have less manual dexterity in a panic situation when the blood pools in the center of your body instinctively. So this trains you to be able to throw even when you have a clumsy grip, when you retain only your gross motor skills. A second exercise for the level 4 thrower is the use of 180 and 360 degree body spins in conjunction with combination throws, by which I mean a sequence of at least 2 throws in rapid succession. This exercise forces the thrower to adjust the second throw of the combo on the fly. Body spins also generate more power on moving throws because they help you square your shoulders and they create confusion. A body spin maneuver might even work in a real situation if it's done from a distance of at least 10 feet from the target. If you're an ambidextrous thrower, you double the number of potential combos. Another little skill to be aware of is switching a knife from hand to hand, which is very important if you can only throw with one hand or need to switch hands to create an attack angle. Ordinarily, you switch a knife in front of the body, but sometimes it's a little quicker if you're moving backwards or sideways to switch knife hands behind the back. Years ago, when I was a little more agile, I set out to develop an exercise that would contain as many different skills as possible into one. What I came up with was a trick called the back toss flying 360. This exercise involves tossing a knife around the back, spinning around 360 degrees while jumping, catching the knife while doing so, and then completing the throw before the feet hit the ground. This involves making a lot of adjustments, in this case quite literally on the fly. A simpler variation of this trick is to start with your back to the target, toss the knife in front of you, and do a 180-degree leaping spin before throwing.
I need to warn you, make you aware that the kinds of tricks that we do are not just designed to create the impression of danger and skill like something you might see in a movie or in a stage performance. They involve real danger and do take real skill. You're doing these tricks where you're trying to catch a knife out of the air while you're jumping up and spinning around. You have to make that catch. You could easily cut your hands. You could knock the knife back into your face if you fail to make it. You're going to need to stick that throw because you're falling towards the target in a lot of these, and you're left defenseless if the throw doesn't stick. It could bounce right back at you. These are advanced exercises that are meant for really more very, very serious throwers. They're not appropriate for beginners, and maybe they're not appropriate for very many people at all. Having reached the stage at level 4 where every throw is different, every situation is different, there's really no need or no possibility of further instruction. The only higher level of knife throwing would be to actually use it in the real world. And obviously that would take place in some kind of societal breakdown situation where maybe the ammunition has become unavailable or maybe you need a silent weapon. Now, societal breakdown is probably more likely than a lot of people think, but it might not take the kind of extreme military type scenario that a lot of people envision. I think a more likely scenario would be temporary lawlessness. Perhaps these would create situations of urban chaos, urban combat, and maybe something dealing more along the lines of home invasions would be situations where knife throwing would come in handy.
I would rather have knife throwing as a hobby than shooting. It's less expensive, it makes less noise, and frankly probably creates as many useful skills that are applicable to a much broader range of situations. Nothing against firearms, but being able to shoot a rifle doesn't really get you in shape or improve your balance and coordination very much. Knife throwing does. And remember that at any kind of indoor range, a knifer can get to a man with a pistol or shotgun before he can even draw it. Now, don't get me wrong, all in all, I'd rather have a handgun, but if I only have one survival tool, I want a knife and I want to know how to use it. Knife throwing isn't necessarily about knife throwing, as strange as that may sound. By that I mean that the secondary skills you develop may be more important than the primary skill, that of sticking a knife. Weapons throwing teaches you about attack angles, about awareness, about how to move your hands and feet. You're going to use a pistol or a shotgun or any hand weapon more effectively if you make improvisational knife throwing a part of your life. If you can throw a knife while moving around like this, you can probably do a lot of things.
We're interested in realism, not in Hollywood fantasies. You're not going to whip a knife out and hit somebody in the neck with it from 50 feet and kill them instantly. So we don't want to overestimate what knife throwing is capable of. We're not trying to replace conventional knife fighting skills. We're trying to supplement those skills. By the same token, we don't want to underestimate knife throwing either. I think the reason that maybe a lot of existing combat systems don't incorporate throwing into their systems is because they're not aware of this type of throwing. This type of throwing is new, and it is a game changer in a hand-to-hand fighting situation.
Knife throwing is a supplement to knife fighting, which itself is just a form of hand-to-hand combat. And by definition, any conflict involving knives is a survival situation, which means there are no rules, which means you can forget about using 99% of what most conventional martial arts teaches. The best knife fighting techniques are those developed by American prisoners, because American prisons are academies of knife fighting. What we want to do is incorporate knife throwing into prisoner-style knife fighting theory. There is no way to practice a set of skills because every person is different, has different strengths and weaknesses, and every situation is different. That's why a serious thrower has to learn to do everything, so you'll know the trade-offs between different skill sets. There's no one skill set that will work for everything, and every situation you can think of will change as soon as it starts. Nothing is predictable, so we want to avoid being predictable or falling into patterns. Our main practice is quick, powerful, random throws at hand-to-hand range, constantly flowing. Anything long, slow, or predictable is useless because it can be dodged or blocked easily if the enemy knows it's coming. Other than by practicing by attacking with quick, random, hand-to-hand range throws at stationary targets, on occasion you'll want to practice against a human opponent who can block or dodge. Of course, you won't use knives for this. You'll use a harmless, safe object of some kind. I recommend a rolled-up sock as something everyone has access to. Practice like that will teach you a great deal you can't learn throwing against inanimate objects, particularly about angles and what can and cannot be dodged or blocked.
The basic theory of knife fighting we follow is that you want to use your front hand, your empty hand, your weak hand as your defensive hand, and also as something to distract or to set up the opponent for an attack with your strong hand, your backhand, your knife hand. What we do is we simply replace the empty hand attack with a knife throw.
The goal is to use a throw to draw an opponent off balance, to use the element of surprise if possible, and to force a reaction. This reaction will either create the time and space for you to escape the situation or to end the situation with a follow-up attack of some kind, either a hand attack or possibly a second throw. You must have at least 2 knives to throw one, because if you only have one, you have to keep it as a hand weapon. You can't throw it away. For this reason, ideally, you would also carry a fighting knife as a third knife. Getting the knives into your hands before the situation begins is critical and can only come from awareness of the situation. Every situation is different, and every person has different theories about carrying, concealing, and drawing weapons. That's entirely relative to their lifestyle or the general societal situation. Again, you're going to have a different behavior pattern if there are laws as opposed to situations where there are no laws. As far as what knives you prefer, you have to strike the right balance between small size, which gives you concealability, ease of carrying, quick release, and accuracy, or large size, which gives you stopping power, penetration power, maybe even instant kill power.
Remember that offense wins fights, and I'm certainly not suggesting that you do anything illegal, but what you don't want to be is in a position where you're the defender. Now, when we're talking about knife throwing, we're speaking theoretically about lawless situations. And in those situations, you're going to want to put yourself in position to be in first strike position.
How is someone going to react to having a knife thrown at him? Well, he'll have the fight or flight reaction, but we can't predict which way he'll go. But we can predict that a person will duck something thrown at his head. That's an overwhelming instinct. The head moves fast enough that he has a good chance of dodging a throw at his head. For the same reason, you'll have trouble hitting a person on the extremities. The arms and lower legs are probably not good targets. On the other hand, nobody is fast enough to dodge a good throw at the torso if it comes from the right angle. But a torso throw might not do much damage, especially if the person is wearing a lot of clothes. There are a lot of bones protecting the torso. The sternum shields the heart and the ribs protect the organs, the most important of which is the liver, and which isn't entirely protected by the ribs, but still hard to hit. The best target if you want to do lethal damage is probably going to be the neck area. It's much easier and more natural to release a knife at about neck level because that's where your arm is naturally parallel to the ground when you're throwing. But remember that an opponent in a fighting stance is probably hunched over a little, so neck level for him will probably be lower than neck level for you while you're standing up throwing. For this reason, our target area is much like a baseball strike zone, neck to knee height and a couple of feet wide. Different people associated with our school have done experiments and drawn these same conclusions, and I think if you do the experiments yourself, you'll find the same things. Realistic combat range is about 9 to 15 feet. If you're much closer, then you're in a hand-to-hand situation. If you're much further back, you're probably going to want to take a step or two forward before you throw for more effectiveness. Even though you're further away than in a hand fight when you're throwing, the same principles still largely apply. As in hand fighting, you must understand angles and height levels of attacks. Conceive of throws as being just like long-range punches. For one thing, as with punches, you don't try to throw at something, you try to throw through it. A sidearm throw is quick, like a jab. An overhand is like a haymaker, powerful but slow. And an underhand spinless throw is like an uppercut. Remember that you can effectively double your attack angles by learning to throw ambidextrously. Think about how handicapped you would be in a hand fight if you could only punch with one hand. Again, the sidearm throw is the main hand-to-hand throw and is better both offensively and defensively. The sidearm stance is the same as a conventional fighting stance, maximizing defense because you face to the side and present a smaller target to your opponent, and balance-wise you don't lean in and overcommit. Good balance is the key to good defense, and another key is the use of the front arm as a block. Both these advantages are natural to the sidearm stance, which provides the best footwork of any throw, except maybe the underhand. Anytime you're within someone else's striking range, you need to move in a special way. You need to never pick one foot up until you have put the other foot down, to never be moving both feet at the same time. You need to internalize this way of moving anyway because it's going to help keep you safe in practice when you're moving around. Your lead arm, your weak hand, is your defensive hand, and that, again, is part of the sidearm stance, as opposed to the overhand where you're leaning in towards the target. The sidearm throw is the best throw offensively because it's very quick releasing and comes in from an angle that is harder to dodge. Imagine if you were trying to spray someone with a water hose and they were trying to dodge. If your arm angle is vertical, up and down like an overhand throw, you can't hit them because they'll just move horizontally by stepping to the side. But if you spray side to side, analogous to the sidearm throw, they can't dodge because they can't move vertically. The overhand is accurate for a stationary throw or throwing at a stationary target, but the sidearm is accurate for moving throws. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to be able to adjust the angle of a throw as a counter reaction to a moving target trying to dodge, and this is much easier if you use the sidearm.
In a way, we're ending by returning to where we began at level 1, where we're trying to develop power on throws. At this stage, we're especially trying to develop power on a compact sidearm throw while we're minimizing the amount of time that our weight is spent on our front foot.
Remember, power lets you do damage even if you don't hit with a point, so it's the most important thing. With that said, a stab wound is much more damaging than a slash wound, so hitting with a point does matter. In the best of all worlds, what we want is a powerful, quick-releasing throw that has the best chance to hit a moving target with the point and within a couple or 3 inches of where we aimed it, from an angle that is tough to dodge and easy to adjust on the fly, while leaving our feet in good balance and our hands in a position to block an attack or ready another weapon.
The other survival topic that you want to talk about, of course, with knife throwing is the topic of hunting. Now, obviously, throwing a knife at a game animal is going to be a last resort, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. Now, hunting is a little more like sniping, by which I mean that the victim is in a situation where they don't know that the throw is coming.
This type of throwing is likely to come from longer range, and that means we can use the overhand angle and quite possibly the blade throw. This is where the blade throw comes into its own, because the main practical use of the blade throw is to extend our range. Knives are likely only going to be useful against small game, which is one reason to always maintain your skills on low targets. Another way this skill could come in handy would be to use a low throw to defend yourself against a dog attack.
Weapons throwing isn't really a sport, but for lack of a better term, we can call it that. Now, it does, of course, have a recreational aspect to it, but it's really more than just a sport. Every activity worth doing has a unique spirit, and weapons throwing is no exception.
There's a challenge to knife throwing that simply doesn't exist in any other type of throwing, balls, flying discs, frisbees, or anything else, which is that knife throwing is three-dimensional, whereas all other types of throwing are at best two-dimensional. You only have to be able to hit a certain intersection of a vertical and horizontal line with a ball. It either hits where you aim it or it doesn't, but it doesn't matter what part of the ball or the flying disc hits the target. But with a knife, you have to hit that spot, plus you have to hit it with one specific part of the object you're throwing, the point, of course. Knife throwing quite literally takes a whole other dimension of skill versus the types of throwing most people are familiar with. It literally exists on a higher plane. There are infinite challenges and infinite possibilities. I think the spirit that animates weapons throwing is the desire to rise to these challenges. You have to make mind and body one. You have to be able to dream of something, then to visualize how to make it happen. Then you have to actually go out and do it physically. The real thrower wants to be able to find a way to do things that he hasn't done before, that maybe no one has done before. Every thrower wants to come up with some new trick that hasn't been thought of before, or maybe he looks at a certain knife not meant for throwing and says to himself, I can find a way to throw that. Or he wants to prove for himself whether or not some theory he's heard someone else expound is true or not. After a while, the ability to throw creates a certain sense of freedom to manipulate your environment, because there are knife throwing targets and potential throwing weapons everywhere, even in an urban environment. You almost have a feeling that you're carrying a gun even if you only have a screwdriver or a kitchen knife in your hand. The other thing that comes with the danger and the freedom, the open-ended nature of this sport, is a need to be responsible for your own safety and that of others. I can't emphasize that enough. Weapons throwing seems harmless right up until the moment you get careless, but then it's too late, so don't ever get careless even once.
Thankfully, weapons throwing is never going to be an organized sport with all the limitations that go with organized sports, because it's never going to be socially acceptable. Knife throwing, weapons throwing is always going to be an individual activity.
Real weapons throwing of any school is too individualized to fall under a framework where you can keep score, so it will always be built around exhibitions instead of competitions. It will always come down to a guy in his backyard with his own equipment doing things his own way. Serious weapons throwers are self-starters, so I know that you will take only what works for you and adapt everything to your own needs, whether that information comes from me or anyone else. Don't bother to have a philosophy or to be identified with any one technique. Just always be looking to get the results you want any way you can get them. I've been throwing for more than a quarter of a century, and I'm still constantly throwing away old things and learning new ways to do things.
You'll find it self-serving if I say that weapons throwing is the greatest sport in the world, but I really do have a rationale for saying that. Human beings, particularly males, have an instinctive need to throw weapons.
Human beings are physically designed by nature to throw weapons. We survive by using rocks and spears and other throwing weapons to hunt and fight with for a period of time that is orders of magnitude longer than civilization has existed. Weapons throwing is primal, the most basic sporting activity. the foundation of every sport that has come after it. Your desire to throw knives is written into your DNA. Weapons throwing was around for a long time before people ever thought to turn it into a game, and long after all these games you see on television are forgotten about, weapons throwing will still be around. Throwing lets us exercise all those parts of the brain and body that we don't get to use in technological society, and its appeal is never ending.
So in one sense, what we're doing here is the most primal and the most ancient of sports. But in another sense, it's a whole new sport, a whole new way of weapons throwing. New technologies and new techniques are enabling us to do in the 21st century things that were only dreamed of in the past. And one of the main goals of our school is to get away from all the limitations of the past, both in the East and in the West, and bring knife throwing into the modern world. We invite you to join us.